USS Kearsarge, BB-5, the steel Leviathan at the turn of the century. Prologue, Ghosts of the Past and Challenges of the Future. The battle lasted 3/4 of an hour. All the Italian battleships had gaping holes, and their dark sides were pockmarked with traces of English shells. Here and there, a funnel or remnants of a deck survived on a battleship. The Italian ships were a pitiful, shapeless heap of twisted steel beams, riddled iron walls, and sections of sides warped like paper. This is how a naval historian writing under the pseudonym Sea Stern describes a battle in which the English and Italians supposedly met. But this picture of destruction was not just a literary fiction. It became a warning for all naval powers at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. In a world where steel giants clashed in deadly duels across the oceans, each new ship had to be better, stronger, and more technologically advanced than the last. It was precisely at this pivotal moment in history, when some empires were in decline and others were striving for world domination, that a ship destined to become a symbol of American ambitions, the USS Kearsarge, BB-5, began to take shape on the slipways of the Newport News shipbuilding yard in Virginia. Part 1. Historical Context. America Seeks Its Path. A Fleet in Ruins. The Legacy of Neglect. In 1890, as Oscar Wilde aptly put it through The Ghost in one of his stories, the American fleet was truly in ruins. After the feverish construction of 179 warships during the Civil War years of 1861 to 1864, the idea of the need for a strong fleet had again faded into the background. The situation was truly catastrophic. Not a single modern seagoing battleship monitors, once built in a few months, now took a record-breakingly long time to construct, up to 20 years or more. A lack of factories ready to supply affordable armor, a shortage of men willing to serve in the Navy, technological backwardness compared to European powers. But by the 1890s, the imperialistic inclinations of American capitalism prompted some politicians to concern themselves with fleet construction. Their efforts were decisively supported by Theodore Roosevelt upon his rise to power. Assuming the presidency, he immediately addressed Congress. The work of increasing the fleet must go forward without ceasing. The birth of a new fleet, from Indiana to Kearsarge, Roosevelt's persistence prevailed. In 1893, the first 3 American seagoing battleships of the Indiana class were launched. 3 years later, the Iowa slid down the ways. These battleships were characterized by their main and partly intermediate artillery being mounted in barbettes. Then came the second group of battleships, 3 of the Alabama class, 1898, and 3 of the Maine class, 1901. On these ships, the large caliber artillery was in turrets, the intermediate in batteries and casemates. Concurrently, 2 battleships of the Kearsarge class, 1898, and 5 of the Virginia class, with 2-story turrets, were laid down. The American fleet fully utilized the experience of European fleets. The number of main caliber guns on all ships, without exception, was set at 4, with a caliber of 305 to 330 millimeters. The main caliber turrets were mounted in the center line. As enthusiasts of large caliber intermediate artillery, the Americans, alongside the universally adopted 152 millimeter and 120 millimeter guns, often installed 203 millimeter guns. A curious feature, characteristic only of a number of American battleships and found in no other navy in the world. The installation of 330 millimeter main caliber guns and 203 millimeter intermediate caliber guns in 2-story turrets, rigidly fastened together. Many arguments and considerations were put forward to justify this decision. It was claimed, for example, That such an arrangement would eliminate two sets of drive mechanisms and armored barbettes for protecting the bases of two turrets, would save 460 tons of metal, would improve the field of fire, would require only one person to traverse 4 guns in the horizontal plane, that two-story turrets presented a smaller target for the enemy, etc. But despite all these advantages, such a scheme for artillery placement did not take root later. Although it served the battleship fleet well, perhaps it was the two-story turrets of the Kearsarge that led naval architects to the arrangement scheme for main-caliber guns that would become classic 10 years later. Part 2. The Conception and Birth of a Steel Giant. An idea. Ahead of its time. The Kearsarge project was born during the economic depression of 1893. The new Secretary of the Navy, Hillary A. Herbert, was initially not a proponent of costly battleship projects until he came under the influence of Alfred Thayer Mahan's work, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. Like many politicians of the time, he requested funding from Congress for at least one new battleship in 1895, which gave the Bureau of Construction and Repair, C&R, time to develop and debate the best options. Kearsarge was authorized by the Act of March 2, 1895. The Admiralty decided to abandon the raised forecastle and attempted to find compromises for coal stowage, a critically important issue for range at the time. The armor protection was reworked and undoubtedly improved, particularly through the introduction of a redesigned armored deck, which provided more volume to the hull. Simultaneously, the question of returning to the Iowa's main caliber, 12-inch, 305mm guns instead of 13-inch, was considered. But the biggest improvement was the introduction of a dedicated tertiary battery of 5-inch, 127mm, rapid-firing guns, which were then under development, instead of relying solely on 8-inch guns and much smaller ones. This radically increased firepower. The revolutionary concept of two-story turrets, discussions about range and firing arcs led some to work on an all-turret design, but this soon proved unrealistic. Instead, classic barbettes were chosen to free up deck space and use armored walls instead. The limitations were the increased weight of the turret arrangement, ammunition hoisting, and fire control. The choice of a central battery amidships forced the secondary armament of 8-inch guns to be placed at the ends of the hull. Therefore, two-story turrets were selected. Overall, in designing the ship, the engineering staff decided to move away from the low freeboard of the Indiana class and the high freeboard of the Iowa, seeking a middle ground with a higher continuous deck level overall. The design ultimately settled on 3 variants for the secondary artillery. Variant Quote 5, 8 guns, 2 centerline upper, 2 wing turrets amidships. Variant Quote 6, no bow turret, 2 wing turrets further forward, 1 upper aft. Variant Quote 7, centerline turrets, no wing mounts. Variant Quote 8, reverse of Quote 9, only wing mounts. In the end, C&R preferred design Quote 10, which maximized firepower, but they were opposed by the Bureau of Ordnance, BUORD, which wanted to scrap all 4 projects and demanded a new proposal. The two-story turret was actually a concept from Joseph Strauss of BUORD. He proposed this solution to address the available space issues. This very unorthodox turret design, with a second turret fixed atop the first, seemed obvious on paper. Turret stacks had existed for 40 years. But this solution had never been adopted. This led to a 5th version, designated ___, quote, _11__. The only limitation, from a fire control perspective, was the requirement for the secondary battery to target the same objectives as the main artillery. The idea was that at nearly the same range, the 8-inch guns fired faster and could still hit superstructures instead of the hull, for example, due to still possible different elevation angles. It was thought that at closer ranges, the faster 8-inch guns could take over the entire workload while the 12-inch guns were reloading, independent of the turret's rotation. Problems such as the ammunition lift were relegated to technical issues that engineers would have to solve after project approval. However, this was done in the context of much better, lighter turret designs with weight savings. So much so that the two-story layout was actually considered lighter than the twin-gun turrets used on the Iowa. Buord also actively advocated for the return of 13-inch guns instead of 12-inch, as they were 30% more powerful. The 8-inch guns would still compensate for the slightly slower 13-inch guns. Another argument was that tests conducted with 15-inch, 381mm armor plates showed they could be penetrated by 13-inch shells. In the end, the Navy preferred Buord's design, quote, 12, quote, with 13-inch guns. The design was criticized much later, long after the ships were commissioned, for the poorly designed turrets, which engineers thought to improve on the Virginia class, and the, quote, 13, quote, lower battery. But the worst aspect was the development of rapid-firing 12-inch guns. They rendered the entire concept a failure, as the new main guns fired almost as fast as the 8-inch guns. In both cases, the main guns below could not fire without serious concussion effects on the crew and structural fatigue to the mounts. Part 3. Technical Characteristics, a masterpiece of engineering dimensions and construction. The two new battleships on the drawing boards, authorized under the Act of March 2, 1895, were longer than the Iowa, with a length of 368 feet, 112 meters at the waterline, 375 feet 4 inches, 114.4 meters, overall. Their beam was 72 feet 3 inches, 22.02 meters, and their draft was 23 feet 6 inches, 7.16 meters. Displacement reached 11,540 long tons standard, 12,850 long tons, 13,060 tons, fully loaded for battle. They inherited the low freeboard of the Indiana class, 14 feet 6 inches, 4.42 meters forward under normal conditions. But soon that entire area would be underwater in stormy weather. Also a common feature of the time was the projecting ram bow. Power plant. The engine room contained two 3-cylinder vertical triple-expansion steam engines. Each drove one shaft, ending in a single screw propeller. The steam engines were fed by 5 coal-fired Scotch boilers. The exhausts were truncated and passed through 2 funnels. These engines produced a total of 10,000 indicated horsepower, 7,500 kilowatts. Consequently, the maximum speed was 16 knots, 30 kilometers per hour, 18 miles per hour. However, on sea trials, both power and speed exceeded these figures. USS Kearsarge achieved 11,674 indicated horsepower for 16.8 knots, and USS Kentucky showed an even better result, 12,179 horsepower for 16.9 knots. Regarding range, coal stowage was better than in previous designs, 410 long tons, 420 tons, in peacetime, and up to 1,591 long tons, 1,617 tons, fully loaded in wartime. A cruising speed of 10 knots, 19 kilometers per hour, 12 miles per hour, allowed them a radius of action of 5,070 nautical miles, 9,390 kilometers, 5,830 miles. These were the first American battleships to make extensive use of electric auxiliary machinery, with a total dynamo output of 350 kilowatts. The Kearsarge class was steered by a single rudder, and at 12 knots, they required 475 yards, 434 meters, to complete a full turn to port, 455 yards to starboard. The crew of Kearsarge consisted of 38 officers and 548 enlisted men, 549 on Kentucky, but by World War I, it was reduced to 40 officers and 513 enlisted men. Armament, the heart of the steel giant. Besides the low freeboard, side battery, 2 funnels, and ram bow, the appearance of Kearsarge and Kentucky was also distinguished by 2 heavy military masts carrying light anti-torpedo boat guns and observation posts. Main and intermediate guns, 2-story turrets. The core of the design, dictated by space and the adoption of new weaponry, necessitated these _14_ turrets with one level housing 2 13-inch 330mm/35 caliber guns, and on the upper turret, welded to the roof, 2 8-inch 203mm/35 caliber guns. The guns and turret armor were developed by Buord, but the .15 type turret was designed by C&R. They had the vertical walls of first-generation turrets, and the ports were very large to allow sufficient elevation. William Sims participated in the development and criticized this choice, noting that the turret floors were accessible through the ports. A lucky hit could disable both turrets with a single strike. But what was worse, in trials, Kearsarge and Kentucky were considered very poor gun platforms. Not only was the blast concussion a problem for the gunners above, but when both turrets fired, heat conduction caused the temperature in the upper turret to soar, and in bad weather, the upper turret healed even more than the lower one, complicating fire control. Main battery, 13-inch guns. These were Mark II models mounted in Mark III turrets with electric drives. Powder charges used brown powder. They weighed 500 pounds, 230 kilograms, and were therefore difficult to handle, slowing the rate of fire. But later, they were replaced with 180 pounds, 82 kilograms, smokeless charges. Muzzle velocity was 2,000 feet per second, 610 meters per second, enough to penetrate 25 inches, 640 millimeters, of conventional steel at optimum range, closer at 2,500 yards, to 300 meters. With direct fire, it could penetrate 20 inches, 510 millimeters, of steel. The turret elevation angle ranged from -5 degrees to 15 degrees. Intermediate battery, 8-inch guns. The 8-inch/35 caliber Mark IV guns were mounted in Mark VI turrets, also electrically driven. They used smokeless powder and fired 260-pound, 120 kilograms, shells with a muzzle velocity of 2,100 feet per second, 640 meters per second. Their maximum range was 12,000 yards, 11,000 meters, at 15 degrees elevation. Anti-torpedo boat battery. The ship carried 14 5-inch, 127 millimeters, /40 caliber, Mark III guns mounted in casemates on the main deck. These guns fired 50-pound, 23 kilograms, shells with a muzzle velocity of 2,300 feet per second, 700 meters per second. Their maximum range was 9,000 yards, 8,200 meters. Light armament. For defense against torpedo boats, the ship carried 26-pounder, 57 millimeters, Hotchkiss guns, 8 1-pounder, 37 millimeters, Driggs Schroeder guns, and 4 7.62 millimeter Maxim machine guns. Torpedo armament. Like most battleships of the time, Kearsarge was equipped with 4 18-inch, 457 millimeters torpedo tubes located underwater, 2 on each side. Armor protection, Harvey-type steel armor. The armor protection of Kearsarge was impressive for its time. Main belt, 5 to 16.5 inches, 127 to 419 millimeters, of Harvey armor barbettes, 12.5 to 15 inches, 318 to 381 millimeters. Main turrets, 15 to 17 inches, 381 to 432 millimeters. Intermediate turrets, 6 to 11 inches, 152 to 279 millimeters. Casemates, 5 inches, 127 millimeters. Conning tower, 10 inches, 250 millimeters. Deck, 2.75 to 3 inches, 70 to 75 millimeters. From 1895 onwards, all American ships used Harvey nickel armor, later Krupp armor. The waterline belt, initially non-continuous, gradually lengthened, starting with the Alabama class, and covered the hull from stem to stern. Part 4. Construction and Launch Keel. Laying June 30th, 1896. The construction contract for Kearsarge was signed on January 2nd, 1896, and the ship's keel was laid on June 30th, 1896. At the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Virginia. The total cost was $5,043,591.68. She was soon named after the Civil War sloop-of-war USS Kearsarge, becoming the first ship of the United States Navy named by an act of Congress. She was the only American battleship not named after a state. Launch, March 24th, 1898. Kearsarge was launched on March 24th, 1898, the same day as her sister ship Kentucky. The ship's sponsor was Mrs. Herbert Winslow, wife of Rear Admiral Herbert Winslow. The ceremony took place in a tense atmosphere. Just a month earlier, on February 15, 1898, the battleship Maine had sunk in Havana Harbor, pushing the U.S. closer to war with Spain. Commissioning, February 20th, 1900. After nearly 2 years of fitting out and trials, Kearsarge was commissioned on February 20th, 1900, under the command of Captain William M. Folger. By this time, the Spanish-American War had ended, and the United States had become a global colonial power, gaining control over the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. Part 5. Peacetime Service, 1900 to 1914. Early years in the Atlantic Fleet. From 1903 to 1907, Kearsarge served in the U.S. Atlantic Fleet, acting as flagship for the North Atlantic Squadron. Her early years were spent in Atlantic waters, primarily along the American East Coast and in the Caribbean. In June 1903, Kearsarge departed for European waters as the flagship of the European Squadron, heading for several friendly port visits, where the ship hosted German Emperor Wilhelm II in June and the Prince of Wales in July, before returning to the U.S. Kearsarge was then sent to Cuba for the formal U.S. seizure of the Guantanamo Naval Reservation in December 1903. This visit was historically significant. It was then that the U.S. established its permanent presence at Guantanamo, which continues to this day. Goodwill visit to Europe, 1904. In 1904, she again departed for Europe with additional friendly port visits, calling on Portugal, where she met King Carlos I, celebrated Independence Day in Greece with King George I and Princess Alice of Battenberg. After visiting other ports, she returned to Newport, Rhode Island in August 1904. Tragedy on April 13, 1906. On April 13, 1906. A tragedy occurred aboard Kearsarge that forever changed powder handling procedures in the American fleet. During gunnery drills, powder ignited in a 13-inch gun, killing 2 officers and 8 men. The investigation revealed the cause to be an electrical short circuit in the ammunition hoist system. This tragedy led to a revision of powder handling procedures in the U.S. fleet and the installation of automatic cutoff switches in ammunition hoists to prevent explosions in the magazines. Subsequently, Electrical wiring was shielded or removed entirely. The Great White Fleet, 1907 to 1909, the most famous episode of Kearsarge's early service, was her participation in the round-the-world cruise of the Great White Fleet from December 1907 to February 1909. Context and goals of the expedition. The idea for the circumnavigation belonged to President Theodore Roosevelt, who wanted to demonstrate the growing power of the American fleet to the entire world. The fleet, consisting of 16 latest model battleships painted white with gold decorations, was to undertake an unprecedented voyage around the globe. Composition and route. Kearsarge was assigned to the 4th Division, 2nd Squadron, under the command of Captain Hamilton Hutchins. The fleet sailed down the coast of South America, around Argentina, and up the Chilean coast before reaching California for refitting in 1908. The group then passed through Hawaiian waters, rounded southern and western Australia, before crossing the Indian Ocean. Heading north through the Suez Canal, the fleet entered Mediterranean waters, found the Atlantic via the Strait of Gibraltar, before returning home to Hampton Roads, Virginia. Highlights of Kearsarge's participation. Kearsarge was one of the few ships to visit China, Malta, and Algeria during the voyage. Captain Hutchins remained in command of Kearsarge throughout the entire cruise. Significance of the expedition. The circumnavigation of the Great White Fleet was a turning point in the history of the American fleet. It demonstrated the USA's ability to project power globally, the reliability of the new steel battleships, the increased international prestige of the USA, the technical and logistical capabilities of the American fleet. Modernization, 1909 to 1911. Upon returning to the States, Kearsarge underwent modernization at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard on September 4, 1909, completed in 1911. The modernization included installation of entirely new water tube boilers, additional 5-inch guns, new cage masts, removal of 1-pounder guns and 16 6-pounder guns. After completion of the work, Kearsarge was returned to active status and recommissioned on June 23, 1915. Part 6. World War I and subsequent years' service in the Atlantic, 1915 to 1916. Her service again consisted of patrolling the Atlantic coast, while Europe was engulfed in World War I, 1914 to 1918. In September, Kearsarge transported Marines to Veracruz, Mexico, and then to New Orleans, Louisiana. On February 4, 1916, she became part of the Atlantic Reserve Fleet and served as a training platform while America maintained neutrality. Participation in World War I. On April 6, 1917, the United States officially joined its allies in France in World War I as millions of Americans were called to action. A notable action for Kearsarge during the conflict was aiding survivors from the Norwegian barquentine Nordhav on August 18, 1918. The vessel had been torpedoed and sunk by the German submarine U-117. Kearsarge rescued 26 survivors, demonstrating a humanitarian mission even in wartime. The armistice was signed in November 1918, officially ending the war. Post-war service Kearsarge managed to continue her career despite the war's end and defense spending cuts. She served as a training platform and cruised in Caribbean waters until 1919. She was then recalled to the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard and decommissioned in late May 1920. Part 7. Second Life. Crane ship conversion, 1920. Instead of scrapping the still useful vessel, the U.S. Navy undertook a project to completely modify her superstructure to support a 250-ton crane. All her guns and heavy armor were removed. She emerged as the hull classification, quote, 17, quote, which then became, quote, 18, quote, in August 1920. She served in this secondary role for decades leading up to World War II, 1939 to 1945. By this time, AB-1 had been named, quote, 19, freeing the name Kearsarge for a new Essex-class aircraft carrier. However, this new carrier itself was renamed USS Hornet, CV-12, in honor of USS Hornet, CV-8, lost at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. Quote, 20, then took the name Kearsarge and served through the latter part of WW2, being decommissioned twice before being scrapped in 1974. Service during World War II 21 served the U.S. Navy well during the construction of other necessary warships throughout World War II, where her lifting capacity was excellently utilized. She was later transferred to the West Coast at the San Francisco Naval Shipyard in 1945 and ended her wartime service involved in the construction of several other notable warships, including aircraft carriers. The salvage of USS Squalus, 1939. One of the most famous achievements of quote, 22 was its participation in the salvage of the submarine USS Squalus, SS-192, in 1939. Squalus sank during a test dive on May 23, 1939, resulting in the loss of 26 lives. The complex salvage operation, in which Kearsarge participated as the crane vessel, succeeded in raising the submarine, a significant achievement in the history of underwater salvage. Participation in aircraft carrier construction. In 1945, she participated in the construction of USS Hornet and Boxer and the reconstruction of USS Saratoga. Her 250-ton lifting capacity made her indispensable for installing heavy equipment on new ships. Part 8. Decline and Legacy. Return to the East Coast. In 1948, she returned to the East Coast at the Boston Naval Shipyard, where her final years of service awaited. By this time, Kearsarge had already served for over half a century, an incredible achievement for a warship. End of service. On June 22, 1955, her name was struck from the Naval Vessel Register, and the hull was turned over for scrapping on August 9, 1955. Kearsarge completed a career lasting 55 years, 3 decades of which were spent as a crane platform. Her service spanned 2 world wars and the Korean War, 1950 to 1953. Legacy and historical significance. Technical legacy: the 2-story turrets of Kearsarge, though not widely adopted, played an important role in the evolution of naval artillery. They demonstrated the possibility of compact weapons arrangement, the importance of centralized fire control, the necessity of considering the mutual influence of different caliber guns, military strategic significance. Kearsarge became a symbol of the U.S. transition from a regional to a global naval power. Her service reflected all stages of this transition. From coastal defense to global power projection, from outdated technologies to modern innovations, from isolationism to global leadership. Humanitarian aspect. The rescue of the Nordhav's crew in 1918 showed that even warships could perform humanitarian missions, setting an important precedent for the future. Part 9. Assessment and Analysis. Strengths of the Design Innovative Armament System. The 2-story turrets were a bold experiment that, despite its drawbacks, advanced engineering thought. Powerful armor. Harvey armor up to 16.5 inches, 419 millimeters thick provided excellent protection for its time. Good seaworthiness. Despite the low freeboard, the ship proved to be a stable platform. Longevity. A service life of 55 years testifies to quality construction and structural durability. Weaknesses and shortcomings. Problems with 2-story turrets. Mutual interference when firing, concussion, temperature, complexity of fire control, vulnerability to single hits. Low freeboard, made the ship wet in stormy weather. Limited speed, 16.8 knots was insufficient by the standards of the rapidly developing dreadnought era. Historical assessment Kearsarge holds a special place in naval history. Transitional link. Between late 19th century pre-dreadnoughts and early 20th century dreadnoughts, experimental platform for testing new weapon concepts, symbol of ambitions, of America's growing naval power, example of adaptability, unique ability to find a new role after combat service ended. Part 10. Comparison with contemporaries, American counterparts Indiana, 1893. Earlier design with barbette mounts Iowa, 1896. More traditional armament layout Virginia, 1904. Development of the two-story turret concept. Foreign contemporaries British, HMS Majestic, 1895. Classic British pre-dreadnought German, SMS Kaiser, Friedrich III, 1896. German approach to armor Japanese, Mikasa, 1900. Participant in the Battle of Tsushima. Kearsarge differed from most contemporaries in her unique armament system, making her simultaneously a progressive and controversial ship. Part 11. Personalities associated with the ship captains and commanders. Captain William M. Folger, First Commanding Officer, 1900 to 1903. Captain Hamilton Hutchins, Commanding Officer during the circumnavigation, 1907 to 1909. Rear Admiral Herbert Winslow, husband of the ship's sponsor, designers and engineers. Joseph Strauss, originator of the two-story turret concept, engineers of the Bureau of Ordnance, developers of the artillery systems, specialists of Newport News shipbuilding. Builders of the ship. Part 12. Cultural Legacy and Memory Museum. Exhibits. Figurehead, displayed in Dahlgren Hall at the United States Naval Academy. Photographs and documents, preserved in the National Archives and Museums. Ship models. In various maritime museums, influence on popular culture, mentions in historical literature, appearances in naval documentary films, references in naval historiography, memorial events, annual reunions of ships' veterans, historical reenactments and exhibitions, educational programs at naval educational institutions. Epilogue. Lessons of history. The story of USS Kearsarge, BB-5, is more than just a chronicle of one ship. It is the story of a nation striving to find its place in the world. It is the story of technology, balancing between bold innovation and practical expediency. It is the story of people, designers, builders, sailors, whose fates became intertwined with a steel giant. As naval historian Seastern wrote, quote, 24. But the service of Kearsarge lasted decades. From the slipways of Newport News to the Pacific shipyards, from ceremonial receptions with European monarchs to rescue operations in the Atlantic, this ship witnessed and participated in great historical changes. Her two-story turrets, so unusual and controversial, became a symbol of America's willingness to experiment, take risks, and seek new paths. Her long service stood as testament to quality and durability. Her transformation from battleship to crane ship served as a metaphor for adaptability and pragmatism. USS Kearsarge has passed into history, but her legacy lives on, in the lessons she taught shipbuilders, in the memories of the sailors who served on her, and in the role she played in establishing the USA as a great naval power. In place of a conclusion, steel Leviathan of the century's turn, you saw the dawn of a new naval era. Your twin turrets, a challenge to fate, stood guard over the American dream. From Virginia to distant seas, through storms and the turmoil of war, you carried not just steel and fire, you carried an idea. to be first, to be strong, to be free. And when your final hour came, you did not vanish into the abyss of oblivion. You became a crane, a lifting force, to build new ships, new dreams. Such is the fate of great creations, to depart, to make way for the new, but to remain in memory and in lessons like Kearsarge, the ship that was ahead of its time.